From a Shadow Grave started with a ghost story, and some of you will know about the Mount Victoria Tunnel in Wellington that everyone makes a terrible racket as they go through. And one of the explanations for it is that they're trying to scare away the ghost of a young woman who was murdered by a worker constructing the tunnel. And this sort of lingered in the back of my mind for a while, and I did a bit of research about that young woman, Phyllis Simmons, and I was kind of annoyed actually that she was remembered in this way, that people viewed her as some sort of malign presence that lingered around the tunnel. So I started to think not just about what I could find out about her life, but of the different ways her life perhaps could have gone and what she could have done. And that turned into From a Shadow Grave, which really has a few different divergent lines of both what happened and what could have happened. So it's a few genres, but I'd call it historical fantasy mostly, I think. And I'll read from the very beginning. All ghost stories start with endings, but you were a woman, not a story. A woman stumbling the way into adulthood in a world of music and hunger. Let's start with you, not with him. Let's start with perhaps the music you play on your gramophone that you won't sell even though you should, because music eases the pangs of hunger more than the money it's worth. Let's talk about how you dance in the park on the damp grass with your friends when you can't afford to go out, or the smell of the leather seats on the long train rides between Napier and Wellington. Your house is on Mortimer Terrace, close enough to walk to the pictures on Dixon Street. Now that most of your brothers and sisters have left, you no longer feel squashed. You have a room to yourself, except for when there are visitors. And in the morning you sit at the table before your mother wakes up, listening to the tui calling from the trees behind. Your father has finally agreed to let you leave school, and it's as if years of tension have just fallen from your body, your muscles loose, your joints no longer heavy. You begged over and over, not thinking it would happen, and then one evening he said that as long as you worked and paid your keep, he wasn't going to stand in your way. You were never the sort of girl who hugged your parents, but you did then, fighting back tears. No more shame for how your letters came out crooked or back to front, even though you could have sworn they were right. Never again would a teacher bang angrily on your desk when you failed to read a passage, desperately willing the letters to return to the paper and not dancing around above it. You tried telling them once that the letters wouldn't stay still, and your teacher told you to stop being ridiculous, that you were just lazy and maybe you needed to point under the words with your finger like you were still a young child. After that, you pretended not to care, but now all that is behind you. You have no illusions, you know things will not be easy, but there's a difference in your mind between things you have to work hard at and things you will never be able to do no matter how hard you try. You already have some housekeeping work lined up and you're asking around for more. One day, if you can't be a film star, which you suppose at this point you can't, you want to work in a shop, like one of those girls on the makeup counter at Kirk's. There's a future for you where once you could see none.
Cool. Thank you. Has anybody got any questions for Andi from that? I'm just wondering, when you first, so you had your idea.
Yes.
Did you do a whole heap of research first?
I did, and later as I filled in the details. So I started with the sort of specific people involved and the specific murder case, and I used Papers Past a lot for that. So I was digging up a lot of newspaper articles about it and other material from there. And then, as I wrote, there was more general. It takes place from at various points from the 1930s to almost the present day. So there was research about Wellington, was like found in the cinemas, all that sort of thing that's came together.
So at what point did you actually start writing creatively? Like, was that a process throughout, or are you a person that does your research and then goes forth, or
it depends on the book, but I think I need to start writing to work out what project is. So I started, and initially, I mean, part of the reason it's in second person, part of that of second person, is that it started out as almost a letter to her, and it diverged from that once I got the shape of the novella and worked out what it was going to be. But yeah, I really just started writing, and
So, so it's obviously it's based on facts. What is that point of the magical point where you take it further? And so talk to me a little bit about that aspect of it.
yeah, so I think there's a few different types of historical that come under historical fantasy. There's the alternate history, which is where history massively diverges. The classic is, what if Germany had won World War II? What if the South had won the American Civil War? And it creates a whole different world. And then there's the where fantasy is almost an analogy for real-world events. I'm thinking of R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War, which is set in a secondary world. It's not in our world, but actually it's really about the Second Sino-Japanese War, I think. And this is neither of them. This is really a historical setting. So the major facts of the world don't change. But there's fantasy elements through them. People have different lives. I mean, the key divergence was someone lives much longer than she did in reality. So there's fantasy, there's ghosts, there's other fantasy creatures, there's a bit of time travel, and I think that's the thread that was important. That like, sometimes just one life is worth saving, you know, and that's one of the character's perspectives, that she goes back in time, and she can't, I mean, the mechanics of time travel differ from different worlds, but in this one you cannot change major things. And it's horrible. Like, you go back to the 1930s, there's a lot you'd want to change in the world, and she's not in a position to do that, but she tries anyway, even though she knows she can't, because it's important that people do try, but it's also important to her to make an impact on just one person's life.
So I think we can all see that Andi is a very clever person. So when you're doing your research, how do you sort of connect dots and start writing about it from a emotive character sort of perspective, where you can sort of put your research aside for a moment and then delve into that character? Is that a bit that you get excited about? Is it?
I feel the character comes first for me, so but I find thinking about things from those perspectives, living through those eras, I find it very, I'm not sure of the word, but I think when you look back and think, and you have a sense of hindsight and knowledge that the characters in your world don't have, there's something quite poignant and emotive about that for me, and I really want to get it right as to their perspective, but also right for the reader who, like me, has quite a different perspective, and bring in those different layers. But I think for me it's harder to do the research, it's harder to get the details. The characters do really come first for that, but like this.
Cool. What about, I'll just broaden it out. Does anybody else write from that perspective of characters come first?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yes, I do, and I write stories and then I do research that's relevant to the story.
Yeah. So it's a different background. Yeah. Andi, what about your process?
Yeah, it's sort of the same. I'll talk more about it when I come.
Anybody else?
I don't really, my characters are real people.
Right.
So it's kind of a different process in that you've got to learn who your characters are. They're real people. So you're learning as much as you possibly can about them, but you're not inventing them, so you can't. You need you need to be in context of the whole setting because they're already there. You know, so it's a kind of a different process.
Yeah.
You do real historical characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in my one, I have got real characters interacting with fictional characters. And my only rule is not to do anything bad to the real characters.
Right.
Make sure the families have an opportunity to review what I've done.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm really interested in I guess from segueing from Andy's reading, into knowing about when you fragment away from that basic truth. You know, how do you make those decisions with keeping that bit of absolute truth in there and then changing that bit? Like, what are those? Do they just go with the narrative, or do you battle over that?
I think that is a battle. I mean, for me, there's so much written. The Victorians were great. I mean, mine set 1840s, and they were all great writers. They all wrote diaries and journals, and there's stuff in the papers. So much written about these guys that you kind of get a feeling of who they are and how they interacted with each other, and you fill in the gaps. You've got to fill in the dialogue, obviously. But from not so much from what they wrote in their formal writing, but what they wrote in their letters, you can tell the kind of words they would have used, and you start to flesh out that character. So I think it's much easier than making up a character because you've got somebody there, and you can sort of tag things onto them. I can understand these people. They seem to be like people I know the way they start bantering and interacting with each other. So that's how it's for me.
It just totally. I go on wicked tangents, so just bear with me. Something you brought up there with the voice. Is that something that's such a tricky thing in any form of writing? You know, where the character is getting the right voice, and more so perhaps when you got a historical or getting that tone right. So maybe Andy, you can talk to me a little bit about that because it's interesting. You know, with what you've done there with getting that tone right for your characters.
There was an author, and I can't remember who the author was, who talked about historical. They loaded up a dictionary of Jane Austen novels, and it highlighted every word that never occurred. And it was like, just check that word was around. I think for me, because I have time travel, I have a contemporary character who swears a lot, who goes back in time. So getting those two different voices was something that I had to work on. I also think just knowing the details, like I was doing, that they'd refer to, like I was doing research on makeup, and my assumptions about what they would normally have were wrong. I had a great team of students working on this from the Fitty-Ray Publishing Programme, and they came back. I had a character reusing tea bags to save money, and they came back to me and said, Andy, tea bags weren't in New Zealand until the 1960s. I was like, of course they were. My grandparents used tea bags. No, so I think it's when you're building there's a big details you know to research, but when you're building dialogue, you have to get all the little things they refer to, and then you also have to work with the reader's perception of what they expect history is. There's something called the Tiffany problem, and Tiffany was a common medieval name. It was short for Theophania. But if you write a medieval fantasy novel and you have a character called Tiffany, the audience is just there. No, you got that wrong. So you've got to make sure it meets the audience expectations as well.
Yeah. Is there any other hurdles?
Yes, my first historical novel, which was based around the women getting the vote in New Zealand, I used the word suffragette. Absolutely no. The reviewer said they weren't called suffragettes, and I knew it was wrong when I wrote it, so I went back and took it out. It only applied to the British women.
Right.
Oh, interesting. Yes, it's very easy to slip up like that.
What were they called in New Zealand then?
I can't remember. I don't think they were called anything except those
Yeah,
bloody
they
women.
Yeah.
Really, I couldn't actually find anything. I used papers past a lot. Couldn't find them actually called anything because it wasn't just women. Of course, it was men who were also wanting to get
That's
that.
right.
So yeah, there wasn't quite the agonising antipathy towards those women there was in Britain.
I think those details are very important because a lot of people study that history and they will read it because they're interested in that history and they'll say, she got that wrong.
I did, yes.
But
I
it-
went back and removed it very quickly.
Yeah, but another sense is sometimes when you're writing history, you're not exactly using the words they would use for dialogue because it doesn't sound right. You know, for example, they used to swear, if they swore, they would say, God damn. And that was a terrible thing to say, you know. But nowadays, if somebody says, God damn, you think, he's
The
being a
word
bit
hello,
theatrical.
I don't believe was used. It's quite modern. Hello came in when the phone was invented. I have a feeling. I might not be right on it, don't quote me, but you have to avoid saying hello.
Yes, but you've also got to write something that feels this, that you're giving this the sense of it across to other people. So if you're angry with someone, you would nowadays be very different to the way you'd be angry with someone in the past. You've got to make the sense of it right for a modern reader. So that's a really difficult balance.
I think that's true.
I would disagree strongly with
Oh, would you?
I think if you're writing about the 19th century, you have to use the language that we use.
In dialogue you do,
Dialogue.
but not in the text, in the narration. You're a modern person speaking to a modern audience. You're not Jane Austen. And unless you want to do a flavour of Jane Austen and write a book with a flavour.
If you're writing the book from the point of view of one of the characters, then of course the explanations and so on have to be the same. And all my books are like that.
Are they? Yeah.
I guess, yeah, there's a real balance and a real fine line, isn't there? In a lot of what you're doing, you know, how far you take factuality and the creativity, where those, you know, lines divide, mingle, and then there's that narrative voice too. So it's not an easy, would you say it's not an easy genre? I mean, it's within this one, you know, it's not one genre, but it's not an easy path that you will take. In that, you know, if you were just to create, you know, a novel from pure imagination, you haven't sort of got those hurdles that we're talking about now. But I guess in the same way, you also don't have that beautiful springboard that you've all taken on. Where should we go with this? We could go many ways. One thing that I'd like to ask you all, and anyway, maybe I'll start with you. Like, you must just have to read masses of different things. So tell me a little bit about, and then we'll broaden it out, about your research process. Like, what's your first knock? What door do you first knock on, and then what does that open up to?
I'm not sure I have a very considered process, I'm afraid. I start out very well, I'm putting everything in endnotes or one of those, and then it just all goes. I think there's two parts for the process. There's a reading for background where I'll just sit there with papers passed or something and just absorb as much as I can, and that gets me the right feel for the story. And then there's a research for details, and then you're like, what makeup would a working class young woman in 1932 have, you know, and you're getting really into the nitty-gritty, and that's where you're writing notes and checking stuff off. And others probably have more organised processes.
Yeah, and I mean, there must just be wicked tangents that
It's so much fun.
you go down.
Yeah.
Crazy little rabbit holes. So maybe if we go through and just have a natter about everybody's different sort of research points of, you know, starting points and.
For my first book, I used papers past a lot because it's actually based on reports on the women's parliamentary debates and the vote. For the second one, I did a lot of research here in this library, and I rely very much on old-fashioned books. I do Google some things, but I take a lot of museum history books. The second one is based more on physical, based more on the physical layout of the town, which of course it's been been the same since the 1800s. And I actually used the Coach House Museum to look at certain transport vehicles that were there because they're featuring. Look, how did people get from A to B? You know, pony traps, governors' cars, you know, all that sort of thing. So I use every available thing that I can.
Because I suppose I'm lucky than most in that the characters in my books are not historical, that they are pure inventions. And this meant that I didn't have to know too much about what the important people of the day were doing and all that sort of thing. And the other reason I was probably lucky is that I'm an old historian. and my whole entire work has been in history, and I had particular interest in the 19th century. And so it was quite easy for me to sort of generally get the feel of things and knew what things were doing. But apart from that, what I didn't know when I started having the idea that I'm going to write a novel is that I was not really all that au fait with the way people spoke, the things that interested them, the way they treated others, all that sort of thing. So I set about for 15 years reading every single 19th century novel I could lay my hands on. And I've now got a vast collection, and I've got a very, very good idea, and sort of almost instinctive idea of how middle-class Victorians, but remember that the novel's written by middle-class people and intended for a middle-class audience, but that I know almost instinctively how Victorians spoke, what their major concerns were, and how their relationships in the household were, and all that sort of thing. So in that sense, I suppose I was pretty lucky.
Right, so Tony's going to continue the rest of the session in that sort of speed. Okay. Is that good, Tony? Cool. Should we, I'm just looking at the time. I am a shocker, so just everybody Andy just nudge me, okay, and say, come on, let's recap. Cristina, do you want to
Sure.
a little description?
Sure, I'll keep it quick. I started writing Jerningham. It's the early settlement, the colonial settlement of Wellington. And I did it because I was researching my Norwegian history, so I'm interested in the Norwegian settlement here, which came in 1872 to Manawatu, and I put the two Norsewood. And I thought, what happened before then? What happened to make New Zealand the way it was? Why were the people important? Why did they need to cut down the trees? Where were they with the trains? What did the place look like? And I went back, and then I started studying the Wakefields and the early settlement of New Zealand and how the New Zealand Company was formed. And Jerningham Wakefield, the young son of Edward Gibbon Wakefield, kept jumping up and going, hello, I'm here. And I thought, he was 19 years old at the time when he arrived in New Zealand. He was a philanderer, he was a drunk, he was a wild child. And I've got 3 children about the same age at the time. And their friends would come and sit around the table, and they'd banter and they'd laugh and they'd drink. And I thought, I know this man. You know, he felt like a man that I knew. And it's 180 years, but I still felt he was the same as these young boys who want to go out and adventuring and know the world and are bulletproof and can do anything and nothing ever happens to them. And I kind of, Jerningham kept on talking to me. I thought, I know this guy, I know this man. And so I thought I had a real connection with him. And from him, I started learning about the rest of the Wakefields. And they were very a motley bunch, but really interesting. They all had fascinating lives. They were charismatic and entitled, and they thought the world belonged to them. And this is the start of Pākehā House sentiment in New Zealand. And this is where it came from. And it's quite powerful beginnings, you know, to show how we got to be where we are now. I think it helps me understand what it means to be a Pākehā in New Zealand, to think that a lot of this is where we came from, because these are the guys who laid out what the world was going to look like, and then they imported people like the Norwegians, my family and things. But this was the start. So I'll read you the very first bit when Jerningham, he's been here for 6 months now. He's been on a traveling around, and he's just got back to Wellington. And the narrator is an accountant who's employed by the New Zealand Company to do the books. A whaleboat pushed up onto the shore, and a man leapt from the bow into the shallows. I was some distance away, but everything about his movements suggested he was laughing as he took his bag from a sailor and passed it to a boy waiting on the beach. Within minutes, onlookers gathered, and they stood within a circle of welcome, hands reaching forward, calls of greetings. Men stepped up to help hold the boat steady. while their women remained hidden behind wide-brimmed bonnets, lifting hems of dresses well used to the wet. Children, both Māori and European, hopped close, elbowing for attention. With a wave of the man's hand, the children flung themselves to their knees and scrabbled for the treasure he'd strewn in the sand. Jerningham Wakefield had returned from the north. He looked younger than I'd imagined, angular and boyish in his movements. He wore a battered cap over a growth of dark hair, and he was unshaven and probably unwashed. The sailors handed across crates and barrels, and Jerningham pointed directions, this there, those over there. These are the canvas tents on the tussock. The boat emptied and was returned to the tide, and Jerningham reached out to clasp hands with each of the sailors, waving goodbye, shouting his thanks. Behind him, Port Nicholson dazzled in the sunshine, and the lee of the island, the Cuba and the Aurora were peacefully anchored, sails tight against yards, flags listless in the still air. Closer in, the newly arrived Tory was active with sailors, and laden rowboats carried men and goods, drawing long wakes across the inky blue water from ship to shore.
I found it really interesting when you were talking about your journey into this book. It was really cool how you were talking about your son and grandsons. And I think you said the word "why" at least 3 times in the first 30 seconds.
So the word what?
Why?
Why?
So is that a starting point for you? Is
Yes,
a questioning mind,
Mm.
and but I really liked that you're bringing it with some relevance to thinking about how your son is now.
Yeah, why is a really interesting question. I think that's every historical writer thinks, or every historian thinks why, and then you find out what, but why, and then you find out, and you keep going back and back. And I could have gone back a lot further than this. I had to stop somewhere, but you have to think, well, if this was the case, why was the New Zealand Company invented, and why were they so keen to get out of England, and why was Jennings' father in prison, and what influence did that have, and why was his grandmother, why did she do what she did? So it's, you can't stop saying why. It's
Yeah, it's a good
annoying
question
to think,
to-
why?
Yeah.
Why? So it's that sort of thing.
Yeah, because I imagine everybody in the audience will have an interest in writing. So maybe that's something to see involved with is that continual questioning, I suppose. And I mean the tricky bit is finding that narrative, and you find lots of interesting stories along your journey, but finding that thread of narrative and how you then sit down and write.
Yeah, I did far more. This was my first published novel, and I did a huge amount of research. But what I did was I read everything in world history and New Zealand history for a particular time period. So starting with the arrival of the Aurora boat in Wellington Harbour, or Port Nicholson it was then, and I just did a big Excel spreadsheet with everything that's happening in the world. So you had the corn riots in England and the New Zealand Company coming out and who was in power and everything that happened in New Zealand and everything I got from his diaries, because Jerningham wrote these wonderful diaries and published them. They're a best-selling book in England. So I took all the incidents from his diaries and I cross-matched them with every incident that Hobson was doing, was happening in the New Zealand government, and every bit of information I could find out about New Zealand, every book I read, I sort of added to that timeline. And then I drew a story through it. So I decided what incidents, it ends up with the Wairau, the Battle of Wairau, but it wasn't going to, but I just thought that just kept on singing it. I could almost see it in the spreadsheet. So I just picked my incidents that I thought were interesting from a New Zealand history point of view. And Jerningham was emotional, and where he wasn't, he was influential. So so I just sort of drew it through on the timeline.
So you definitely had a map in front of you.
I'm one of Mandy Harger's students.
Right.
She has everything mapped up.
Down. Yeah. And what for all of you here, you must just we're kind of getting a picture of how much knowledge goes into this and what gets chucked away and what is still in your brain but we'll never know. So is that similar for everybody here that you to have this book in front of you? There's also this sort of breadth of knowledge behind you that you've chosen to add in, turn away from, learn from, and then you said you had everything that was happening in the world.
Yeah.
at that period of time.
But it does all influence. I mean, the fact that there were Chinese boats coming into New Zealand trading. So, I mean, it probably didn't, I think it appeared in the story somebody had some Chinese beads that they gave when they went to visit the local park.
It's the ladies.
But they did have Chinese beads because there were Chinese traders coming in, I know that. But it's, you know, that was probably 6 weeks of research for one throwaway sentence.
Yeah. Amazing. We appreciate it. I really do.
The next book won't be like that.
I just like to say it's very true about a lot of people come to me and they want to write a family history. And I always say to them, don't write Auntie Meg married Uncle Jim and they milk cows. Look at the world around them, what influenced them to be milking cows, what was going on in the wider thing, because you can't just keep it tight. You have to look at the influence from outside, even international influences.
Is that wide thing again? Why
Yes,
was it?
you must look wide and then bring it into focus on the family.
Right, I'm going to be really good. Sorry. Kirsty, do you want to read?
Yeah, I'll stand up so I can actually see you all.
This book?
I'd like to thank Rachel for inviting me to come and talk. This is my first novel. It's called The Strength of Each Shows. It's a parallel narrative, so it's actually the story of 3 generations of rural women. So the modern woman, it was easy for me to write about because I was raised on a farm east of Eketahuna between Alfreton and Turania, so I understood what that was like for my modern woman. The next generation is based in Kingseat Hospital. Jane has been badly burnt and is mute because her throat has been burnt. So it's a story narrated by the psychiatrist who's looking after her. And she is teasing him only writing with poetry. So there's 15 poems. And in my back history as a physiotherapist, I went into Kingseat and Carrington Hospital not long before they shut, which was in the 80s, and I don't think it would be much different in the 60s. So I could write quite easily on that. The area where I really had to do research, I started to think about this book at a time when we were all thinking about the centennials of war, and there are a lot of books coming out about the First World War. But I never saw a book about the effect on rural women of those men coming back. And the area I grew up was settled by returned soldiers several times after several wars. And my great-grandfather had a lovely story, but stories need conflict. So I chose the story of the returned soldiers who settled the Mangapura Valley above the bridge to nowhere between, they settled there after the First World War from about 1917, and the valley was closed in 1941 after a big flood completely. And from the Depression onwards, they were gradually leaving until at that time there were only 3 families left. So my history was easy to source and absolutely fascinating because before all those old families had died off, Arthur Bates had written and interviewed particularly a lot of the women who had been in that valley. So I had wonderful anecdotes to work from. And when I looked at it, there were only 26 families and only 3 towards the end. And I wanted to write about the latter end of that period. And so I couldn't fictionalize them. So I actually put them in as real characters and brought in squatters as my fictional characters who were become the protagonists of that part of the story. So I'm just going to read very briefly to you. The grandmother in the story is Meredith, and the story starts with her leaving Wanganui after she's nursed her her great aunt, and has nowhere really to go in 1932. And her friend writes to her from the Mangapura Valley, and her friend is Agnes Anderson, who is a real person in that valley. And so I'll just read you the letter that she writes, inviting Meredith to come up the river to be with them in the Manawatu Valley in 1932. 28th of February 1932. Dearest Meredith, fancy me spotting your aunt's death notice in the paper. Reg says I'm quite the detective. I'm not sorry the old duck's dead. You may be sad because blood is thicker than water, but I'd have to say some blood needs a little thinning, and I would put your Aunt Gwyneth in that category. You know me, Meredith, never one to put my words through the mincer. It seems like such an age ago since our childhood days, and how the times have changed for us both. Anyway, we have been up here in the Mangapura Valley for quite a few months, and the time has shot by. We had to walk off Reg's father's farm, went broke when the wool prices bottomed out. We needed somewhere to go where we could at least be together. I didn't want Reg having to go off to one of those work camps, so we took a lease on some land up here when a returned soldier had walked off his block. Just the tough ones still farming up here. Hard going, but at least we can feed ourselves. There are no shops for miles and we don't need to spend much. We live like kings on wild pork, butter, cream, eggs, and not forgetting all the fruit and veg we can grow in my little garden. Louisa plums grow really well up here, and we have taken up making the most delicious yellow plum wine, and the local dances are great fun. Reg says he is as much wine, woman, and song as any man could ever wish for. When we arrived here, there was no bath, and the dear man built me a beautiful wooden one. He measured my posterior and had to build it 2 boards wide. This is real information from Agnes Anderson's Real History. And from reading that, I always assumed that she was quite a plump woman, so I had her as a big, vivacious woman. And after I sent out the book to the families, one of the grandsons sent back this gorgeous picture of this very upright, slender woman, and I had to change because my thought of her, they must have been narrow boards that they used as stuff. He measured my posterior and had to build it 2 boards wide. Now, so I added this bit. Now, don't go thinking this is due to my ample proportion, just that the boards are on the skinny side. I keep trim up here running around after our little ones and getting my garden going. Proud to say, after 3 children, I can still fit into my best tailored skirt. Only problem is, not many outings up here for our Sunday best. We live in a bush house. It's just a slab hut when we arrived. Imagine that, with Michael, our baby, only 16 days old, just 2 rooms and you could see daylight between the corrugated iron pieces on the cooking chimney. But Reg, bless his heart, has fixed it up. He's divided the bedroom in half and cut more shingles to add another room. And there's a worry out the back if we have a visitor, and not to mention our fancy new bar and a little alcove off the kitchen, even if we do use a potato for the plug. But enough of my work. Why don't you come up here and stay a while? Free board and as much as you can eat. It would be great if you could help me with the little ones. We could have such fun, like we always did those years ago. I'm wondering if you're over Peter yet. I know he was keen to be a farmer. If he'd made it home after the war, this is just the sort of place he'd ended up living anyway. If you do come, please bring some sheets. I have used up all my spare ones, dyed them bright yellow with onion skins and hung them up under the tin roof to stop the drips falling on the beds when we have a big frost. Very bright and gay they are, even if I say so myself. By the way, there are still bachelors up here who need good farm wives, so make sure you bring double sheets just in case. Always a keen nose for a good match. Hope you can come soon. Had best sign off as Teddy the mailman will be riding by any minute. You'll love the trip up on the riverboat. Makes you feel quite the lady staying at Papariki House. Got to go. Drop a line soon. Love from your dearest old friend Agnes. So all those things that Agnes was saying are actually, lovely anecdotes from the history of that ballet.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Something that comes out for me there is that, when writing a book like this, you've done your research and all of that sort of stuff, but there must be there's a certain characteristic that you all must have that comes down to, there's a big element of intuition, sort of that you're a, conduit for these stories, and that sort of emotive fleshing out and bringing the character in. So maybe talk to me a little about that intuition that you have, that you know your characters, you know your research, the historical setting. At what point you just follow your instinct, you follow your gut.
Well, there are certain things when you write to real history that you have to take account of. For instance, the bridge to Langley was built in 1936. That's actually a picture of them building it. And you know that there was a huge flood and the valley closed in 1941. And I knew exactly when each family left the valley. So you had to work within those timelines to make the story realistic to the history. But by bringing in fictional characters, Meredith is fictional, and the man who she settles down with is fictional. then the story just becomes a fiction with a background of history. And as I said, I always just use the rule that nothing bad ever happened to real people. And the families were very supportive of me writing. And it's a gritty novel. I mean, bad things happen in this book because unfortunately that was what it was like. And those things were never written in history.
So when you're writing, how long did it take you to the whole process? Like I'm wondering for everybody else too, how long was the process of research, everything, writing? How long did it take you?
It was Witty E. Hamira who encouraged me to write a novel when I did a course with him, and the following year I did my master's, and I wrote the first draft of this. And it took quite a long time and quite a lot of editing after that process and rewriting to get it into a publishable state. So I think maybe, I don't know, maybe other people want to talk about that.
I was about 2 years. I did about 6 months research, then a year's writing, and then 6 months having it booked into shape. Editing's a huge job. But wonderful. I mean, I loved all the editing was brilliant. I loved doing that.
Andi, how long do you sort of bother around?
I did a very, very quick first draft of this because it was a writing challenge.
I'd imagine Andi would write quite fast.
But it was an extremely rough, like, I remember at one point I found a bit in square brackets that said, there's a ghost during the war, and that was all I had. So it was an extremely rough draft, and I sort of put it away because I didn't know what to do with it. It was a weird length. It was in second person, and then Maria Paper Road Press put out, looking in the back corner there, put out a call for submissions for science fiction fantasy novellas with New Zealand connections. And then it was probably about 6 months of solid research and rewrite. Like, it was a total rewrite, it wasn't just editing. And then of course there was editing with the publisher. So it probably was about 2 years total as well, but sort of in fits and starts.
Kirsty, with your novel, you must just get so immersed, and because it's it's about where you're from and all those sorts of personal things too. You get so immersed in the place and the time and it almost becomes like a landscape of in your mind, a place you can go to. How do you when you finish it? How do you walk away from that? Because there's still stories to tell.
Well, I had one of the things I was so lucky about. 93-year-old Meredith McDonald was a 14-year-old girl when the valley closed, and she's got a memory like a track. And she was even able to tell me the names of the people's horses and things like that. So I just had this wonderful, huge resource. Lovely story. She and her 4 sisters did all the shearing because there were no boys in their family with hand shears. And when she was 9, she shore 9 sheep with hand shears. She was left-handed, and Reg Anderson, actually, when he left the valley, he gave her a set of hand shears to shear with. And she shore 9 sheep, but she said, because my sisters were older, I did the dagging, so she'd grab them and sit on them and dag them. You know what I mean? It's lovely stories. So I think you actually develop wonderful new relationships with people that you meet by serendipity, really, when you take on projects. And people come to you, like, I do believe that, like the right people just sort of emerge.
I get that. I get so many people say when I'm doing the 1840s, the first ships, and everyone says to me, "Oh, my ancestors came on the native New Egypt, and my person came," as if I'll have this encyclopedic. But sometimes I do. Sometimes I say, "Oh, well, that doctor's at 1842 and blah blah blah," and I know quite a bit about the ship they came on. As if it's so long ago, past in memory, no one will know anything about it. But
are there, opening this out to everybody, are there things that you stumbled upon along the way, those tangents that you couldn't necessarily get in your book, but just were like these amazing facts or amazing stories that you found, and you just, like, is there any little stories about a crazy thing that you found?
I'll just relate one thing that I didn't know where the person who was very roughly the heroine of all the 4 novels in a way. I didn't know anything about her, and I couldn't find anything about her. But anyway, so I had her die on a particular day in 1884, and I forgot, April 7th or something like that. And then I stumbled upon completely by accident that this woman had actually died on that day.
Oh,
spooky.
And on that note, we'll make Tony read, shall we?
Yeah, oops. I didn't know which sort of one, which one of these I'd be able to be more appropriate to read from, so I'll read from some of this. But the person I was talking about, who is the heroine of all these 4 books, really, she runs right through it, even though it covers 160 years. Her journal continues through the ones that are right up to date, so she is, in fact, the heroine all the way through. And she is completely fictional, except for this very bare bones. I was in England for a year as a visiting fellow, and I was told by my mother to, while I was there, to see if I can find anything about her maternal grandfather. So I went to Wales and I found all sorts of things, most of which I didn't really want to know. But of course he was a sort of semi-historical figure. He was sounded a wee bit like Jerningham, actually.
Okay.
He was a rake and a drunkard and a
Love
philanderer and all of those things. And so I sort of went off him pretty quickly, but then I saw he was married. He married when he was still in England before he came up to New Zealand. And all that I could find was the name of the woman. And I thought, that's not fair. So all of these stories really are the result of my making something out of this great-great-grandmother of mine who received no mention at all and had this philandering husband. So that's how it all started, really. And that was way back in the 1980s, and the whole thing sort of gestated in my head. And as I say, I read lots of novels to try and get, and so on and so forth. But I thought rather than do anything which shows her character, I thought I'd read a bit from a book about the man, her husband. I had to write about him too, and he's the more historical part. But this is actually more about 2 relatively minor characters, and it's just to show how a knowledge of, or an understanding, I suppose, a sort of sense of how things operated in those days in a fairly remote part of the United Kingdom. This is in North Wales near the town of Criccieth, and this is a sort of dialogue between a woman who was married to a Welsh minor gentry, but he died, so she's a widow rather, I should say. And she takes on for a little while the training of her daughter-in-law's maid to try and make her into a lady's maid. But then, horror, she's told, she learns by a strange coincidence that this person that she's training up has decided to leave. Horror. The more she thought about the injustice to herself that the girl's precipitate action would engender, the more peevish she became. She decided she would make one final effort to persuade her that her proposed desertion was nothing short of a betrayal, and that she must therefore change her mind and tell the man that she would not allow herself to be spirited away from the care of those who had her best interests at heart. Being so determined, she rang the bell. The girl's Welsh, and forgive my attempt at a Welsh accent. Yes, ma'am, said the girl on entering. Branwen Goch, I have treated you well since you have been here, have I not? Yes, ma'am. And you have been improved by my instructions to you on certain matters? I am sure I have, ma'am. There is much more I could do for you. You need not spend all your time at Penrith, you know. There is much more you could learn from me here. In time, under my instruction, you can become a lady's maid of the highest order, and as such you are much sought after. Then perhaps you will be a fit wife for a man of some standing. But I have a man who wishes to marry me now, ma'am. So you have told me, but who is he, this man? How is he employed? He is a sailor, ma'am, and a good Christian. A seaman? I cannot allow you to run away with a seaman, no matter how much of a Christian he claims to be. He is Chapelle, I imagine, as I am myself, ma'am. I'm not convinced that Chapel people are Christians at all, in the true sense of the word. There's too much enthusiasm amongst Chapel people. It is unhealthy. Too much enthusiasm and not enough understanding of the ways of respectable and orderly society. Chapel people are altogether too Welsh. He's an Englishman. We intended is English from the county of Hampshire, which is quite near to London. Goodness, child, I know where Hampshire is. Well, it does not signify that he is from Hampshire, nor even that he's English, though I suppose it is understandable it might seem so to you. But there are rogues and ne'er-do-wells even amongst the English, you know, and the seamen. They're the worst sort of people, unless they're officers, of course, and sometimes even then. And what is an Englishman doing hiding away in this corner of Wales? How do you know that he is not guilty of some misdeed? I believe you are being dangerously incautious. Yes, ma'am. I mean, no, ma'am. No? What do you mean, no? You are being dangerously rash. There is no other word for it. I might even say that you're being stupidly rash, though I dare say you have the boldness to disprove that too. Excuse me, ma'am, but I don't mean to be disagreeable. I just know that he is a good man and that he has sworn to treat me well. You are determined then to go ahead with this foolish adventure? You intend to spurn the advantages I have pointed out to you? You are going to betray the faith that my son and daughter-in-law have placed in you? She really felt considerably irritated, and her discomfort was increased as she felt a sneeze come up on her. She tried to stifle it, but was unsuccessful. Well, what do you say? At least you have the grace to hang your head. Do you still mean to defy good sense and throw yourself on the mercies of this seaman? Yes, ma'am. Another treacherous sneeze shook her, and she snuffled vanquished into her handkerchief. Good riddance, you silly girl. I hope you don't forget it. Go, out of my sight. Which would have ran after the babe with great willingness. It's delightful.
Should we get Tony this one now? I mean, the interesting thing with your the 4 books, isn't it, Tony? That it goes right through to the present time, isn't it?
It does.
Yeah. So did you know that from when you started out writing the first book? Did you know there was going to be 4 books? Did you know that's where it was going to go? Like how far did you plan it?
Not really. I knew the first 2 because originally they were 1. Until a very wise person came along and said, "That's 2 books, not 1." So
That's right. You're telling me that. Yeah.
And I wanted, even though after I finished it, I did want to go on to do another bit, but it was only to take it up until about the 1950s at the latest. But then I thought, it's not really fair. I'll take it right through to the present, so it does go through to 2018.
So, I mean, obviously, you I'm imagining the tricky thing would be to get all of those decades and eras and correct in the way that you were writing it.
Yes.
So tell me a bit about that and how you did it, and which bit was which period was easier for you? Which was your sweet spot?
The easiest were the Victorian ones, because as I say, I was very careful not to have anybody other than middle-class people in some language reasonably well. Although you can get some dialect from Dickens and others, but really they're looking at it from a middle-class point of view too. So that was pretty easy. And then the modern ones were easy, from about 1980 onwards, because I must admit that much of the dialogue I based on my daughter as she was growing up, and I was acutely aware of the fact that she spoke in a very different way from the way that Adelaide, my heroine in the 19th century. And so that dialogue came pretty more difficult bits were between, because I was not quite so familiar with them from about 1915 through to about 1940 odd. You know, that was very I tried to
and so, it's interesting that you gave a voice to this voiceless woman. There was no story about it. That's sort of where it began, wasn't it?
Yes, I really thought it was unfair. I got quite upset at the fact that my great-grandfather had all this information about him, most of which, as I say, I didn't really like very much, and that he had a wife about which there was nothing at all.
Isn't that the way in history, right? Like so much about the men and the women are domestic, just in the shadow.
Right. All I knew was that she was the daughter of of a clergyman schoolmaster at Cheltenham Ladies' College. That's all I knew, and I didn't know even when she died. But I gave to somebody who she could not have been, I think, because she's mixed race, whereas I know that this woman wouldn't have been. But that was another angle to put on it, and I really enjoyed that. And of course, I had my daughter in mind because my wife's Fiji and my daughter is a mixture, and I wanted to use my knowledge of the difficulties she's faced in life as one of the things that is spurring me on.
Because I know from your the short story book, what was the short story book called?
Original Sin.
Yes, yeah, I really love that. I put people onto this book a lot because it's a real gem of a collection of short stories. The thing I like about it is that they're like little vignettes of just they're not huge big stories, are they? They're just little vignettes of people stuff, which is a bad way. Tony's really good at creating character and sort of questions and emotions. So in your book, people are important to you, aren't they?
Oh yes, yes. All my things are character driven.
Yeah. So again, are you basing that off? Where does that come from? Do you think?
I don't know. I know why it's women characters who have always are what I want to write about more than men characters. And that's probably because I was brought up by my mother. I had a sister as my companion growing up. I married a woman, of course, and I have a daughter and I have 2 granddaughters. And I'm surrounded by them. And I've got this, and they're all strong. They're all strong. And I guess this is another thing that drove me. I wanted to honour them.
I love that idea if you've got strong women in your life and you want to write about the equivalent in earlier times,
Yes.
but to write a strong woman of Victorian times, you're really nibbling at the edges. There's nothing like a strong woman would be nowadays who can stand up and speak for herself and put her thoughts across. That feminism throughout history is a really interesting topic, I think. To write a woman in the 1800s who's out swashbuckling and doing these wonderful, it wouldn't have happened. It would have been outrageous if it had happened, and not appreciated. And so doing a woman through that period of history that you've done is quite interesting because you've got to get that nuance right, that what is appropriate for a woman who wants to step out. She can only step out a little bit at a time.
Exactly.
That must have been interesting writing that.
Right. That's
Well, we've only got that time's gone. You don't have to read about it, okay, but
My first novel I wrote, historical novel, was called The Case of Distant Relative, and as I said, it's based around the universal franchise movement. And my main character is a girl called Sophia Holmes, who comes out from England to Wellington, and she sets up a secretarial agency. Now, in those days, only men were secretaries, so she was quite different. She'd done it in England, so she came out. So I had to research typewriters. I had to research the streets in Wellington because I wanted her business to be set up in Willis Street, so I had to think of a number. And then I had to look at what was around her then. Stuart Dawson's jewellery was still there. All those things. I had to work out how long would it take her to walk from there to Hailing Street where she gets into an opium den. It's all this sort. It's a murder mystery. And so I did a lot of research. I used papers fast particularly, and every chapter in the book is dated, and it starts from 6 months before the parliamentary vote. And I went to Papers Past, I used the Wellington Evening Post, and a lot of the quotes in the chapters are actually on the day that they were printed in the paper. And I'll read you some of the opening stage, and then I'll read you some of the quotes. This is Sunday, March the 12th, 1893, Wellington, New Zealand. Ladies, we must work even harder for reform if we are to succeed with this new petition. Go out onto the streets, into the workplaces, the factories and shops. Spread the temperance message to all our sisters and persuade them to sign up for suffrage. Sophia Holmes felt excited as she rose to her feet to applaud the speaker. Around her, the audience cheered, crying out their support for the stirring words delivered by their chairwoman. This was only the second meeting of the Women's Christian Temperance Union Sophia had attended. But already she was swayed by the rhetoric and willing to do her best to enable the goals of votes for women in this, the farthest colony of the empire. The public hall in central Wellington was decorated with banners proclaiming the WCTU motto, for God, home and humanity, and rosettes pinned to the jackets of the committee members stated the same refrain. Enthusiasm filled the air, endowing everyone present with a sense of purpose and the possibility of being involved in a historical landmark for the women of New Zealand. And then a little further on, she's at another meeting. This is on 23rd of March 1893, and the chairman is addressing them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to read you some quotations from staunch leaders of our movement. Let their clarity of thinking and fine reasoning become an inspiration to us all. First of all, Marion Hatton, who last year addressed a public meeting at Waimate with these acute personal observations, and these are all real quotations from people. It used to be argued that women's brains were smaller than men's. Women must be an inferior being. Then it was discovered that a calf had a larger brain than most men. So by the same process of reasoning, the calf should be the superior animal of the two. The chairman of the WCTU held up her hand as the audience erupted into laughter. She waited, allowing herself a wry smile until this had died down, before continuing to consult her notes for the next quote. Also last year, Jane Smalley said, "It takes infinitely more brains to train our children than to rear sheep, and yet are not many of our members of parliament farmers?" And so it goes on in that stage. So that book is really based very much on actual debates and parliamentary quotations. So I did a lot of research for that. I just finished doing my BA, so I was really keen on research. And at the back you'll see a great long list of all the books. I was so sort of academic, I couldn't do bibliography in. And there's a lot of different books there. Just briefly, this book here, Sweet Bit of Justice, is the third book in a trilogy based around Fielding. These are historical romances. And of course, I've got a lot of research from the library here about Fielding, but there's a particular vehicle in this book which is in the Coach House Museum. And I had to go and study it, make sure it would do what I wanted it to do in the story. And I actually wrote this book because of that vehicle, particular vehicle. I've always wanted to include it in a book, so I wrote the book around the story. But this book is based on a young woman lawyer, and she graduates the year after New Zealand's first woman lawyer, Ethel Benjamin. So she's quite something. She comes to Fielding and sets up a practice, and she has quite a lot of male intolerance to her being a lawyer. She's a criminal lawyer, which is even worse. She ends up defending a murderer. So that's me. I've written, I think, 7 historical novels. I'm not going to write any more. I'm going to go modern now. But it's really lovely to write around Fielding, because I can include a bit of Rangitikei as well. I've included Westall in one of my books, and of course it's all there. And I have included a lot of real characters. I did take the liberty of bringing Kate Shepherd up to Wellington in this book. I know she never came to Wellington, because, and you find out, talking about extraordinary things, that the Christchurch newspapers didn't support her at all. She actually had to hire a page in the Union magazine, but the Wellington Evening Post editor was absolutely on the side of the Union.
It just goes to show, isn't it, that there's so many stories there to be told.
So I just love, I could just write dozens of books about people in New Zealand history, although I'm not a New Zealander.
Yeah.
There are some fascinating things in New Zealand history. You never hear about it.
We need to get them to the world.
So Jill, for you, is it the what are the things that you obviously your amazing detail, but what are the things that you really look for and think that's what I'm going to write a story about? Is it a people thing? Is it a political thing? Is it what is it that you grasp onto?
Well,
really
I do like to write about fairly stroppy women. Give you a chance. And my latest book is about all my books are sort of in the 1880s, 1890s period. I've written a trilogy of books in Wellington, which are also set around boats and women, but they're more erotic romances. But the third one is about a woman who sets up a woman's magazine, there were a lot of magazines, but they're all very politically. But this is a woman's magazine, you know, and there's a rivalry between her and the local newspaper. So I looked at unusual things that women might have done, possibly, like the secretary and the lawyer. That's where I start from.
I think I'm going to ask you lot to ask some questions. We're all dying to with your little questions you want to ask, so go for it. Oh, come on.
I'm just wondering whether with historical fiction, it seems as though because you're dealing with real people and real timelines, how do you know when to stop? How do you know when to cut off? Because I imagine that the feeling would be to dribble on and on.
Yeah, I know. I kind of got that when I left journeying on an absolute high. Well, he'd been stripped of his everything and sent back to him in disgrace, but he then published a wonderful book, was on a great high. But then I thought I didn't want to leave it there because that's not the end of his story, but that was the end of the book. So I did a final chapter, and someone, I think it was Renee, that said, "Oh, you can't possibly do this an epilogue, just stick it in as a chapter." So I did go to 30 years ahead to do my final chapter, just because it seemed unfair to leave him on this great high when that wasn't. He needed to get his comeuppance, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, today we have been talking about historical aspects of writing because that's what we need to talk about, but a story is driven by the character arc, and the story stops when the character arc is complete. So, and each of us really has taken a fictional character who would have been part of that character arc. So we are writing fiction. Does that make sense?
I think that's an important distinction because at the other end, when you're writing history, some history drifts into fiction too sometimes when historians start to express their own opinions. And the continuum goes right through to the other end where there's very little historical about it, but it's still has a vaguely historical setting where there are no real people, unless there are no historical figures in it. But from that to the other, there's a sort of continuum.
I think there's a possibility of also taking minor characters and expanding them into another book and using the same, you know, because you don't see how they react to certain things, but you can do that. I've done that several times. I've taken characters and made them into another book, and you can still use the same research, but it's in the same situation.
But one of the nice things when you're writing historical characters and the true characters is that you people can always go online and look up and say, well, who was this guy? Who was Sam Revens? He had the first newspaper press. What happened to him? And they can find out online what happened to him. And he went and set up a farm. And so these characters do have lives. If you're writing true characters, they have lives outside of the book. People look it up on Google.
How have, if your books include this, how have you handled foreign language? Some of you, we've got some Norwegian anecdotes probably, and Welsh and so on. So, and what about Maori excerpts or language bits that might come into your novels?
I've written a novel where I did Maori characters in 1988. I try to be really sympathetic and it's all right.
One of the problems I had was that, yeah, you should do. One of the problems I had was that it's very hard to find Maori language from 1840. So what people are, people might say this is the Maori language now, but would they use those phrases in 1840? That's really, really difficult. So I did the best I could. I went to the local, it was a very, a Te Reo speaker at my local library in Hastings. She went through a lot of it, and then we sent it off to a Te Reo speaker. My publisher sent it to a Te Reo speaker to get it checked. I still don't know whether, I don't speak Te Reo, so I don't know whether whether that's correct or not, but there are quite a few. The Europeans are trying to learn a bit of Te Reo, but what they're talking among themselves, it's very hard to, whether it's in context of the times or not, I don't know. That was the two hard ones.
And your Norwegian...
Interrupt for a moment, they're just going to test the fire alarm. It's just a test, all right? Just thought I'd tell you that.
Beautiful.
And your Norwegian characters?
That's not this book. That's
No, I realise that.
It's told from an English point of view. So it's an English girl looking at the Norwegian, so I haven't actually got any Norwegian. I've got a little bit of Norwegian in that, but that's translated from a Norwegian friend of mine, and it's sort of not part of the story. So I haven't told it from the Norwegian's point of view. It's somebody looking at it.
You mentioned Welsh. Some of my characters in one of my books speak Welsh. Are Welsh speaking, so their conversations, their dialogue is in Welsh. But believe it or not, I sort of say, he said in Welsh.
I didn't speak Welsh, so I looked at him blankly.
I avoided Larry expressions in my
I think it adds a lot of colour and expression to that. Certainly these guys, 1840s.
Yes.
The missionaries were very active in New Zealand right through the North Island anyway.
Would they?
And because I've written about my ancestors and my husband's ancestors, the Maori lady that I wrote about, she had been trained by missionaries, and so she spoke English.
A lot of the Maori were much better educated than the Europeans. In the 1840s, they found that the colonials found this, that the Maori had been missionary educated, a lot of the children, and they could read and write beautifully, and yet a lot of the English who came over were illiterate. You shouldn't always go down to the descendants.
She had a Maori name, but she called herself Elizabeth.
But on the other side, my great-grandfather who came out, great-great-grandfather came out about that time, did the mail run from Wellington up to Wanganui on foot and became completely fluent. And I think a lot did just to get along in society.
A lot of them did, yeah. A lot of them did speak quite good, quite Te Reo on those days. Yeah, it wasn't fluent, but it was because with the Wakefields, there was a young Maori man that they'd found in Europe on the sailing ship, and he lived in their household for 2 years, and he'd come out with them on the boat, and they had language lessons, so he had taught them an amount of Te Reo. I don't know how much, but they were all very well educated, bright men. So
I had that real fast this time. I haven't written a novel that from the point of view of a historian, I had to type the translated version of Joanna's World about them.
oh yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the part that I really enjoyed about it was, first of all, I had to go and, when it was being converted from Norwegian, the author had written it for a Norwegian audience based on the research he'd done here, but he was a friend who was deceased now. He could write for them and say whatever he liked about Northwood directions and all the rest of it. But when it came to being converted to New Zealand and where the local people were going to read it, I'm going through there and thinking, oh my God, no, that road's not there, it's north, it's not south, it's not this, it's not that, the bridge didn't burn down, this didn't happen, and all the rest of it. But then it got into the really nitty-gritty where he had not wanted to say to the family or point out to the family that the wife had been pregnant when she married. And so he had converted the date of marriage back a few months, or whichever direction. However, the big deal with this family was that when she had been married so many years or something, the Queen or something had given her some kind of certificate, the real life character had been given this thing, and well, that's really interesting, but you've said you got married when the king and the one had abdicated. You were doing it under that time, but you got this from that person on this date, blah, blah, blah. And it was really, really fortunate that she actually got given it at whatever had happened at the end of this guy's reign. So we converted it back 9 months, and that guy had stayed, the king had been in power for precisely the right length of time, and it was able to do it. But the other thing too was, I was the only female involved with the writing and converting and all the rest of it. And the men were sort of the translator, who was Johan Bonnevie, and the author, who was Stan Molstead Andresen. I've forgotten his first name. Yeah, anyway. Really is a scam. He got translated when he got to Northwood. They just renamed him Horse Thing. They had put in things that a woman wouldn't write, like the joys of childbirth. And so, you know, here's me putting little sentences in once the labour pains stopped and stuff like that. So little conversions where the male perspective was not actually what the woman who was the central character would say. But it was really fascinating. And the dog died. And I was so upset, and they forgot to say what happened to the dog. So I created my own story about what happened to the dog in this translation. They loved it. And I thought to myself, this is so cool.
You're rewriting history then.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother session.
I'm a historian, but I can modify.
Yeah, you want to talk about conflicting history and stuff.
Yeah.
That's where
Yeah.
a lot of histories massage 9 months one way or the other.
Oh, it was traumatic. And then the family says, but we wouldn't have minded that being done, right? Then we sort of thought, well, we didn't know. And the translator, he had no idea that that Stan had done it, and that was thought. And so there's one conversion of the historical fact for the lady had caused all this mess up. However, fortunately, the king abdicated at precisely the right time, and so it all stayed together.
But you have a commitment to the truth.
Yeah, I know. We didn't know there was a truth. We didn't know. The translator and I, we had no idea. We thought it was all accurate. That's the point where we something wrong here.
Yeah.
And so,
You asked the why, which is an important thing to do. Continuous whining. There you go. It's a new phrase.
Continuous whining.
Continuous whining.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. We've gone over time, which I'm famous for, so that's good. Thank you to the library. Thank you to everybody here. Thank you so much. And thank you to Rachel too for being a great connector.
yes, thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to have some
Yes, we can. Thank you for that. But I seem to work out.
You know, you've got to
It's such a common story though, isn't it? I think if you know what it is, you need to know about the girl on the tunnel, right?
it's just
And that's why we honk when you get to But some people say you honk to wake the girl up. Some sure, you honk to leave us too.
You can just see the
Which is such a
they were edited to a previous life, weren't they? So
good time. Well, that's even that's probably
something
and thought about it and gone back through it because to critique someone's book you have to really very hard. They wanted me to mark one of the manuscripts from the master's group, $460. Plus that I would have also read a 6,000 word exegesis, sort of analysing, justifying academically why she's written away ahead. Well, I just, there's no way. There's no way. Definitely can't not see it.
it just goes to show that you've got to read it.
Yeah, just got to shovel away and read it.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. No one's ever written that. So it's Kirsty, is it? She's so chock-a-block, to be honest, because it's just the one baby that really is. I know what that's like. Yeah, and she's present. She's got a little one. She's only young. She's got a little she's pregnant. January. So, and she sort of just started this up, and now she's sort of doing it hearing this, which I'm sort of come on board because she's not. She comes from like human resource sort of rural background. She's not a journalist. She's not an editor. She has got a supportive friend who has a similar magazine. So we've got support. I mean, I've been answering crazy questions that I'm really not proficient in answering, but I'm sort of the closest to having a connection to, publication. I'm sort of trying to encourage you that you read something that I'm going to read, just so that I don't have to answer the question. Just really the little things like copyright and things like that. So she is really smart, and then she's not doing a lot of advertising. No, she doesn't want. She's very firm on the look of the magazines, and she doesn't want the look of the which is great. And the ones that are in there are so quite, and that really give the right sort of time. But we started doing a review as well. Reviews. The third one, the third publication came out today.
today. I just had to do that in my head. It came out today. And so that's got a new, so each publication, because it's just sort of evolving, you know, just sort of making it up as we go along.
Just sort of wanted to support her, and I thought she was looking for
I'll mention. I'll be seeing her on Wednesday night, so we're doing this podcast through the magazine that's sort of sticking out as well, so we've got funding creative museum. So it's all process of the horror film. So at the moment it's nationwide. So on Wednesday, to Darragh, I'm holding a community workshop to help people. So it's about women telling their own stories, and then we'll find it down to 20 women. So I will do the workshop and then work with them, support them to write their own story. It's not big, huge, you know, just like 300 words. And then it's the photographer, we do photos, we do some video, so it's about women's connection to language, and then we're hoping to slowly do voices of Foxton and voice of Cornwall, you know, all over. So she's really great with that sort of stuff.
I think she essentially thinks lots of configuration.
Yes, that's what I said. That's what I said, Jill. So we're interested in the older one. Well, I'm going to Spain this week because I said that, and she doesn't think so. I got that one, and it was really hard during lockdown. So I just did the one on Janet and every night because I work with me. And that was sort of, and I said to her, so the next one, next Monday, I'm going to later into beautiful woman, and she's in her 70s, and she's just delicious. She's just, I can't wait. She runs a, she does the farm on her own, and she has horses, and she teaches, she's just really cool, really seems quite wonderful. She's living in the this new publication that's come out today, the cover is just stunning. It's the kindness of the top. Yeah. So this is the Molly one that's got it on the and I'm also doing the side by side, which seems to be my thing. I really picked her up on that because she's young, you know, and we're all sort of like pretty young things.
Yeah, so it's not all in our 70s, doesn't mean so little.
Yeah, so that was so she listens, and she's really the good thing about Kirsty is that she takes advice so easily. There's no sort of, she's not too set on a so you'll see that the magazine's just going to keep changing because as new people come on. Well, she really started off just and so she's sort of accumulating this sort of team behind us. She's not making a lot of money, so we don't.
No, we do expensive to produce.
Yeah, we definitely do it for the love of it. Each time, each publication, she's sort of like, well, you change me back a minute, you know? I had a charge from my table, I didn't go away, I just paid for my house. Each publication, she's sort of like, I think I'll charge you this time, you know? Good. Yeah. Well, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for that. That's all right. Thank you. Oh, I'm exhausted now. Oh, it's not one of you. Yeah, okay. So, do you need anything?
I don't think so. I've got a few things in my bag. And,
Yes. I'll get you a glass, but there's. Take those away. There's water here.
oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, no. You don't put it there.
Oh, that's all right. I can see he's here. I can see that where he is. Hi. Are you Rosalind's husband? Son.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. Yeah.
You must have wanted to see crazy with my children.
All right. Oh, yeah.
I'm Mary Lewis, and Rocky Lewis.
Rocky. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've heard. Yeah, I've heard the name. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 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 Good old play centre, yeah. That's right, yep.
Many years ago.
I know the name. Oh, yeah.
Saw your mum.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So tell your mum Mary Lewis is about.
Oh, will do.
Her and Denise.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, excellent. Yeah, no, I'll tell her that.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yes.
It was Rocky and Cora. How old would you be? You bad age.
43. So, yeah.
That's Rocky's 15.
Right, okay.
And Cora's like 21. Going on 15.
Yeah, yeah.
So you must be.
Oh, yeah. I think they're probably closer to my sister and brother more than me.
More than you?
Yeah.
You're younger.
I was younger.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Did you go to Rocky school?
No, Darragh.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because you're only at the play centre.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
that's
right.
right. Yeah.
When you hear, when you're older.
Right.
Oh. You start singing, you work hard for your money. Right, join your song. I'll tell you how and the one that you think that yes, and the lovely ladies do.
The other end.
Yes. You know, sometimes
I went, the first one I went to, you were down with.
don't take this for what?
Yes.
It's called this.
And she does it thing, the animals.
No, that's all right.
Oh, did you? Yes.
You want to come and tea?
I've got his book too. I've got this book. I've got his book.
No, it's placing with his family. His brother and sister. I know his mum quite well. A long time. Yeah.
She couldn't find one. I said, well, I've got to go because talk starts at 9:30. So I said, I can't. Because the other thing that got so I said, yeah, that was interesting. I did it, but I like it. So that independent. No, they're not independent. No. That one and that one. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, something that's not been, something that's not been covered before. So, yeah, that was really interesting. Oh, so we just would do one. That's cool. That's very cool. And then I'm trying because otherwise I'll be having all day, so it's a bit hard, and I really want to got 15 minutes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but the booksellers one was interesting. What was that? Oh, right. Waffle on for hours. But that was really interesting. The Hunter Girl was great. She only sells in New Zealand. Books. I think it's quite a small one. But this one is she's roughly she's got an four books. Yeah. Got a waiting list for books. Interesting place. Well, I don't know exactly where she is. We went to Cindy got an answer. Cindy's done so that she'll let one. Anyway, I've noted a video in the room now. I saw something about live stream. Short stories. She was on the panel. Oh, okay. And she was saying that which would be really interesting. So she had to do it with voices. I've just started reading that. It's different, but it's readable. It's quite a long discussion about bestseller lists. Next thing. Not really they are, depending on which one you look at, you know. Okay, they've got a whole list of magazines. This is interesting. I remember last time they had some talk about and they also had all the books, but it was hadn't been read.
A meeting.
So
You still like it?
That's right, yeah. Thanks for sitting in.
You must believe I agree with you. I really don't, but it's quite hard.
Yeah, right. You know,
I think it's nice because you realise how long ago it was that you did whatever it was that was.
Yeah, when someone gives you a plant, you sit on the tree and the tree.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, I don't. Good.
Yeah, I'm going to try and